Thanks for joining. My name is Marissa Sepeg. I'm the Director of Product Marketing, and this is our NEOS Academy on security. I'm going to hand it over to Jim Garrett. He is our CTO. Thanks so much for joining, everyone.
Thanks, Marissa. Hi, everybody. As Marissa said, we're going to talk about security. We're going to do this on a couple of fronts. First and foremost, we're going to talk about security in general and why having good security processes in your firms matters, and the impacts that kind of thing could have. And then we're going to talk about how NEOS supports those good security policies and procedures and processes as we go. So, at a super high level, why is security so critical to a law firm? First, we've got a lot of legal and regulatory compliance. In our space specifically, firms handle a lot of personal data that is private, and it's subject to local laws, federal laws, state laws, retention policies, privacy handling. All citizens have what is known as a right to be forgotten as well. So it's important that everybody understands the data you have is incredibly sensitive and needs to be handled carefully and treated with a ton of respect. Professional responsibility is a great one. You really don't want to be in the news for having leaked people's medical data and things like that. It can do some brand damage. It comes off as irresponsible and can damage your brand, for lack of a better way of saying it. And client trust and confidence is very, very similar as well. As if you think about personally, if you were giving your family's medical data over to a business, you would want to have the confidence that they're handling it correctly and that they wouldn't be exposing it randomly or treating it with anything less than just absolute respect. We have a ton of cybersecurity risks these days. There's a study recently that talks about 90% of the security breaches that happened in 2022, 90% of them were caused on some level on some threshold by human error. So, having all of these systems and having all of these postures and having all of these protections are great, but the people have to take it seriously as well, because at the end of the day, with the shared responsibility of security, people are the front line. And so making sure that every employee and every staff member of your firm understands cybersecurity risks is really one of the most powerful tools we can have. And then business continuity. One of the things that a lot of people overlook when we talk about security is you've got to make sure that the data is somewhere. You've got to make sure that your systems are somewhere. You can't protect something you don't have. So it has to be running. It has to be highly available. It has to be somewhere, hosted or physically running, so that you can protect it, and all of your processes and procedures will bear fruit. If you don't have access to your data, or if it's offline, or if it's lost, or if it's out in the wilderness physically, it's really hard to protect. So don't overlook the business continuity aspect of cybersecurity. To baseline, so that we all understand what personal data is. Anything that can be used to identify anybody. That's a client. Don't forget that this also includes your staff. You are absolutely responsible for protecting the identities of your staff, as well as your customers, as well as any granular identifying information that they have. Okay. Talk about what the top security risks for firms are: data breaches, cyber attacks, human error, and third-party risks. So anytime you have this much sensitive data, being able to protect it and being able to categorize it and make sure that it's behind logical and physical security is incredibly important to prevent or mitigate breaches as much as possible. Cyber attacks, again, law firms are pretty vulnerable to cyber attacks, including phishing and malware and ransomware and things like this. And going back to 90% of those being in some way contributed to by a human that was inside the organization that was attacked. And the human error on that is really, it's a big player here, right? Is human error versus when you're talking about, accidentally disclosing something, we can talk about, interacting with an email that is a phishing account, or installing malware from some phishing email. But we can also talk about being misconfigured. We could talk about having over applied security to your individual role, which sets up a person to leak data inadvertently. And then third party risks. So if you're passing sensitive information between your system and another vendor, it understand that their security is an extension of yours. So the minute that you engage another firm or another vendor or another company to do, medical records requests or background checks or anything like that, and you hand them that information, you are responsible for their compliance on that information at this point. This is, it's a business associates kind of a agreement, an extension of data handling. So if you are responsible for protecting information and in turn hand that over to another vendor to perform a task that may be, perfectly acceptable, you are by extension inheriting their security. So it's important to make sure that you vet the policies and protections that they have in place. For a security policy to be successful, you really have to focus on a few objectives to make sure that you're getting the best coverage and the most breadth out of it you can. So confidentiality. We talk about least access. What this means is always understand that a person in your firm should have the least amount of access to the data that is required to perform their job function. If it's over ascribed, if we give somebody too much access, we're causing ourselves to protect something that isn't part of the normal process of business. So you're introducing risk for no gain is another way of saying that. And the management of this and the configuration of this, it seems like it's a little bit heavier lift. In reality, it's just mitigating the price that you may have to pay later by ensuring that users only have access to what they absolutely need to. The data needs to be accurate, complete, altered, not tampered with, which is also in step with least access. We talked about availability, making sure that you always have access to it, making sure that it always exists somewhere, making sure that the authorized people are able to access data to protect it, update it, handle it when they need to. And basically, you need to understand what regulatory CNA, certifications and attestations that you need to have covered in your firm based on the types of practice you're doing and the geo location you're in. And it's very, very good process to go through and identify all of your risks, identify in your process, in your workflows, where there are potential risks for data information leakage, and then cover them. And excuse me, as we do, this is a great segue into talking about how to actually implement an effective security process in your firm. So the very first thing you need to do is conduct a risk assessment, much like any insurance carrier would do if you were getting cyber security coverage. Find out what data you have, what infrastructure you have, what your workflows are, who handles data, who has access to data, who handles payment information, who handles anything that could be considered data or considered information or considered infrastructure that might be at risk or might be a target for some bad actors. Identify all of it. Then you've got to figure out what's at risk and how to protect it. You've got to develop security policies and procedures. People have to understand their role in the overall workflow. There's a saying that if it's not documented, if it's not signed and accepted, it didn't happen. And this very true for security policies and procedures. We can all talk about, we handle information very well and we take things very seriously and we're very, very careful. But if we're not actively training employees on our security best practices, if we're not actively, getting some sort of measurement that they understand, we're not really tightening that up, and we're leaving things open that could be problematic. implement access controls and data protection measures. This is, there's a concept of shared responsibility, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward. But there are some aspects of security that can only be performed at the firm level. We, as Assembly, we are in a Microsoft data center, and Microsoft is responsible for securing their data center. When we publish our Neos artifacts into Azure, we are responsible for ensuring that they are secured and that they are protected and that they are securable. The firm is responsible for executing and not undermining that security. And you may ask, how can a firm do that? Sharing passwords, leaving your screen open to somebody's personal information and walking away with no configured desktop locking mechanism, printing out things and leaving them on desktops, leaving your doors unlocked. And some of that sounds silly, but the truth is there are some aspects of data protection and security that can only be done by the end consumers. And it's important to implement those and then regularly monitor their efficacy against the things you're trying to protect. It's also super important to have an incident response plan. So what if something happens? What if somebody calls in and you realize that you have exposed data, that you have leaked data? Certain states have different reporting thresholds. You may have to announce to all of your customers that you leak data. Depending on what was leaked, you have so much time to respond. You may have to report it to the federal government, depending on the sensitivity of what was leaked and the scope and breadth of what was leaked. So it's important to have an incident response plan and then practice that. It will also, as part of doing that, we call these a table exercise. As part of doing that table exercise, you will continue to inform steps 1 and 2 here. So you will get down to step 6, you will run a table exercise on it, and in all likelihood realize that we have missed something in step 1 or 2 and go back and tighten that up. And that's really what step 7 is about, is continually improving. The threats change and the actors change and the mechanisms change all the time. So it's important to continually inform and update your processes. So after that high level security overview and just talking about these things in principle and thematically, we're going to talk a little bit about how Neos supports these activities that we just called out. So first of all, Neos security, the CNAs that we have SOC 2 types 1 and 2, which basically is a federal standard that we are recognized and audited against for how we handle information, for how our systems are built, for the type of access controls we have. And this is both Neos and Assembly as a company. So we have to train all of our employees on a regular recurring basis on cybersecurity and how to handle things and how to interact with things. And at the same time, Neos as a platform is audited to make sure that we would not prohibit any of our customers from adhering to these same standards that we adhere to. So we've got to be able to have, all of the APIs are locked down and the infrastructure is locked down, and we're governing access, and we have role-based access control and security and all of these kind of things. And then the other thing that we do is once a quarter, we work with an ethical hacking group to have them try to hack Neos and give us any feedback that they can find. And so we do this every quarter. We pay people to try to break into both Assembly infrastructure and Neos hosted infrastructure. And then this feeds into our process to make sure. So, looking at those things and what I just said, I'm just flipping back on the slide, is that this is basically what we're doing with step 7 here, is we are regularly, quarterly having a third party come in and try to break us and tell us if we have any doors open that we don't know about, or if anything new, or if there's a new tactic. And we adjust these and respond to anything that comes up in these as we go. So talk a little bit about the shared responsibility model here. And, we are an Azure shop, as I talked about. We are all of Neos is hosted in Microsoft Azure. So when you talk about a shared responsibility model, this is the breakdown of who's responsible for what. So Microsoft is responsible for security of the cloud. That's the best way to think about it. They make sure that the Microsoft Azure data centers are secure, that all of the infrastructure in there is secure. They have, tens of thousands of employees that are constantly monitoring security of Azure to make sure that it is covered, and that if there's anything happening, they're responding to it, they're updating, they're informing their processes and all of those things. Excuse me. Assembly, we're responsible for being secure in the cloud. So we have to make sure that anything we put out in the cloud is secure as a deployment, that everything we expose in Microsoft is able to be secured or is secured by us or our customers. We are responsible for the proper configuration of those security features, right? The weakest link in the chain is always the further to the right you get here. So, Microsoft has all of these awesome security tools, all of these intelligent threat detections, all of these automated responses, and all of this kind of AI driven, routing traffic if it looks like it's malicious. And for us, we have to implement and enable all of those things, which we do, to get the coverage that Microsoft has to offer. So everything that Microsoft has to offer, that is this AI driven response and the threat intelligence and all of that, is in turn enabled against Neos, at both the UI and the API level, which means that if Microsoft has tooling or has any intelligence to recognize a certain kind of threat, we are enabling that, so that by turn, Neos actually has that ability as well. Then the customer is responsible for security from the cloud. Once traffic or data leaves, if you think about a flow chart, once it leaves the Azure data center and leaves Neos and is on your monitor or in your hands or on paper, the customer, the law firms, our users are responsible for handling that and treating it with the respect that it needs to be protecting for what it is. So we talk about protecting access and credentials. Don't share passwords. Don't use a sticky note and put your password on here. Don't give your password out to a coworker to log you into a system and help you with something. Those are just mishandling and security loopholes that you will introduce on the right hand side of this, that basically starts defeating everything on the left hand side of this. So it's important to understand that we all have a role in securing information and having a strong security posture in this. Then we talked about making sure that their data is always available. So what you're looking at here is actually the Neos deployment ecosystem, the way it is deployed. So when you see those smaller blue circles with the white inside, Neos UI, the website aspect of Neos, and the endpoints are deployed in all of those locations. The reason they're deployed there is, it gives you a little bit better performance on things when you are hitting an endpoint closer to you. These are distributed across a content distribution network, a content delivery network for Microsoft. And so generally speaking, when you type in app.neos-cloud.com, you are going to one of those 28 circles. And generally speaking, it's the one closest to where you are. The larger circles are where our databases are hosted, and those are active with failovers into other networks. So what this means is, for instance, if I am in the Eastern Seaboard there, and I connect, I'm going to get one of those endpoints, and then when I start hitting my database, it's going to go to that one that's right next to me. But let's say that there was a regional outage in Microsoft and we lost the East data center of Microsoft. What would happen is, if you still had internet connectivity, you would start just working off of those dots that are a little further away from you. So the data is failing over and the databases are still running, and the API and the website aspect of Neos are still running. They just get further away from you. And so realistically, for Neos to be completely down, we need to have a global outage of Microsoft and or multiple regions. Now, as this is happening, understand latency increases. The further you get away from the consumer, latency increases. And excuse me. And basically, you'll see that we always say that it's better to be degraded than down. And that's nobody wants to have anything go wrong, right? But the way that we build Neos is that it will continually fail over, and it's going to get a little slower. It's going to be a little more latent. but generally speaking, you'll still be running. There'll be certain aspects of things that fail and certain aspects of things that are fine. And we try to have all of this horizontal separation so that core things continue to run. And as hard as that may be to hear sometimes, the best thing that is possible is to have a worse experience than you had an hour ago, because a lot of other people and a lot of other deployment models are completely offline while you're having a little bit of slowness, or while you're having this one feature isn't working because it's a different service that is having issues. So there's some strength in this deployment model, even though sometimes the way it shows up is certain things feel slow or not working. It's the alternative to having outages. And it's important to understand this, because this also means your infrastructure is always protected, your data is always protected, and the access is always protected by our security rules and by these active intelligence and threat detectors that Microsoft has running, because your data is constantly behind one of them. It's never just sitting there waiting to be accessed. Okay, we talk about also making sure that you always have your data. So I want to make sure we understand how Neos database backups work. Now, everybody understands that when you are a Neos customer and you have your documents in Office 365 and your SharePoint, those are yours. So when I talk about database backup retention, I'm talking about the databases that are running your case data, that are running the information you see within Neos screens that are not documents or emails or calendars, because your Office 365 is what governs those. So Neos backup retention, we have the ability to restore to any point in time for 7 days in a running window. So if something happened, if there was an intrusion, or if something was compromised at 11:59 a.m. on a Tuesday, we have the ability to restore that database to 11:57 on that same Tuesday, as long as it's within a week. Which, generally speaking, if something happens, it becomes evident pretty quickly, and you'd be able to recover. So, we don't have these long recovery windows for things that can go wrong, where you might need to roll back to that. Then what we do is we take a differential snapshot every 24 hours. We have the ability to retain a weekly for 90 days, a monthly for a year, and a yearly for 7 years. So once you're out of that 7-day window, if there's something we need to go back and look for, or if something happened, or if you're wondering, we need to maybe go and get something we accidentally removed or something like that, these are the windows of data that Assembly has availability to for your data. 7 days to a point in time, then we can get every 7 days, we'll be able to go back 90 days with 7-day windows and get that. We'll be able to go back and get the first of the month for a year, and then we'll be able to go back and get the first week of any year for 7 years and evaluate that data. So it's a pretty strong posture on how far back we can go, and how much data we're storing, and how much we can go back and apply these things if needed. And I think it's good that everybody understands how much data and how much retention and how much protection you actually have on your data at this level. Then we're going to talk a little bit about just security review points in general. We've talked about the data considerations, the location, its storage, it's encrypted, all of those things behind Azure. We've talked about the information security, the standards and policies, and the auditability of all of that. The third tier is your ability to govern this data security. So we're going to talk a little bit about the features that Neos has that enable you to govern your security at a little more tight level and a little more granularity, and probably potentially some things here that we aren't clear exist that might help us moving forward. So the first thing I want to talk about, which we actually have a question on. So this is the answer to one of those questions as we're going, is we have the ability to single sign on with Office 365 as part of Neos. And at a firm level, you can actually require this. So you can say, I don't want to use these native Neos identities at all. I want to use my Office 365 and my Active Directory to govern these identities. In fact, this is our recommended best practice. And the workflow that happens here is that you would basically click sign in with Microsoft, any security that you have on your SharePoint, Office 365, Active Directory, all of those things, any security as far as multi-factor authentication, if you're using the text or the call, if you're using a phone app, if you're using, conditional access policies or anything like that that you have the ability to set up in Microsoft, Neos will become subjugated to. So this is a way of basically saying, I want to control and protect all of my staff profiles and all of our user identities using Microsoft, and then make Neos become a subject of those. And so if you use this workflow, you'll get all of those benefits. This is what that workflow looks like. You click sign in, you get your 2FA challenges or MFA challenges, whatever you have going. And then much like you would type in your username and company ID and password on the first screen, the only thing you type in is your company ID. And so you'll basically, if you're signed in with Microsoft, if you've been in a browser in Office 365, you'll get prompted for your company ID. You type that in, and you're in Neos assigned to that user. And keep in mind, this is fairly seamless because as part of being a valid user, a licensed user of Neos, everybody has to be associated to a single Microsoft identity anyway. So behind the scenes, if you sign in with Neos, we're actually signing you in with Microsoft and using that token as well. So there's no downside other than familiarity and change management, with humans. There's no downside to making this transition. It's all upside, it's all security, it's all better protection. Then we talk about role-based security. And I know that screenshot on the right is a little bit of an eye chart, but if you haven't been out and looked at the granularity that we can apply these security mechanisms to, it's worth a look. So what we recommend you do is configure these roles, permission groups. So go and say, in my firm, what does a paralegal do? What does an intake coordinator do? What does an admin staff do? And basically enable the roles to have the very least amount of access needed to do their job, like we talked about before, and then assign staff to these groups. We have over 600 granular levels of security that are out of the box. 140 of those are group special permissions, right? Like, yes, I want to give full security, full access to cases, but I don't want them to be able to change anything that affects the limb date and things like that. Then after the 600 plus granular things that come off the shelf with Neos, you have the ability to go into these other permissions and add specific exclusions. So you could say, for this one role, I want to have a specific paralegal type, but I don't want them working on med mal case or whatever this is, right? And so you could create this specific group that has all of the access you want to apply for everything, and then say, yes, but not these case types, not these report categories, and not case number 1, 2, 3, 4. So they can do everything, but not that case, not that one case. And it's really, really powerful. And you can keep adding those things together and basically get any granularity, any granular application of security in Neos that you want to a role. And our best practice recommendation is to use the roles. While you can go and override it at an individual level, use the roles and use the individual overrides or exceptions as the outliers for one person that may need elevated security or more restricted security for some reason that is just an outlier to that role. And we'll show you what that looks like here a little bit. And if you haven't been here before, when you see the top, the icon there that is the green check mark, the red stop sign, or the organizational chart looking thing, that is an inheritance mechanism. So if you click that hierarchy, it's going to inherit from the role-based security completely. And if you look at the third row where it says change case folder versus the row above that, that's the visual indicator that the solid green is that I explicitly granted this access for this person. The hollowed out green is that they inherited access from the role they're in. And the inverse is true for the red as well. You would see the filled in circle, meaning I explicitly blocked them, or the hollow red means that they inherited that. And so The best practice here is always use the permission group as a base and then individually override for things that may be an outlier. Excuse me. And then we're going to close this this part of what we're doing with just our recommendations for best practices. Always do role-based with the least access. We've talked about this a few times. It is just the security best practice to always start with security groups that are providing the least amount of access needed to do your job function, and then assign those roles to staff. What this gives you the ability to do is not make mistakes when you are onboarding new staff. That's one of the human error things we can avoid, is that we can really explicitly go and set up our roles. And then as staff are onboarded and offboarded, we don't have to rethink that all the time. We're just saying, you know, this person is a, or this person has a as part of their function. And those are templates that are consistent and applied to everybody. Single sign-on. I recommend using single sign-on with the Microsoft you already have. There are so many strong things that come with that you know, Neos would never provide. Conditional access policies. If you're not familiar with what those are, and you have needs to, you know, make sure that people aren't using your system from certain geographies, even if they have valid credentials. If you want to say, you know, I don't want people signing on from here, or I want to challenge their password every so often, or every time they change IPs, I want to make sure I force MFA on those. You can do all of that, you know, with conditional access policies in Microsoft Active Directory, where Neos, as a consumer of that, we're going to just deliver those things instead of focus our own software development efforts to compete with things that we already have in product. If we just use this integration, there's no sense in duplicating those when, you know, Microsoft, which is one of the leaders in security in every way, is able to deliver all of that functionality through Neos the way we have it built if we just use the single sign-on. The other upside here is that gives your IT staff, or as your onboarding and offboarding staff, you have one place to manage your identities. So if you're forcing single sign-on from Microsoft and somebody, you know, quits, or, you know, heaven forbid, we have an event and we need to make sure we're cutting access immediately. If you're using single sign-on, you only have to disable their Active Directory identity, and then Neos will stop working for them. And then you get local controls are a thing to really focus on as well. So make sure that you're patching your computers. Use strong passwords and authentication. You know, somebody asked what are the password recommendations, and I would say use 12+ characters, have it be randomly generated from a password manager like LastPass, Keeper, 1Password, NordPass. I'm not recommending any of those explicitly, they're all great. Use one of those, have it randomly generate your password, assign that to the identity, and then you know, take that sort of out of the user's hands. So you're not emailing them around, you know, they don't have to remember that. It's in their password manager. Auto lock computers after 15 minutes of activity. This is an important one for just people getting up and walking away from their machine and leaving data on the screen. Just auto lock your computers. You know, if somebody is in middle of something and they get up and walk away, it's on a screen. Anybody could walk by and see that. You know, as small of a time frame as your workflow allows would be a good way to set that. Encourage your staff to save their work regularly and not just walk away from in-flight data. You know, this is another thing too, is if you're typing and you're inputting data and you're in this big long process, you know, save small bites. As soon as you're at a place where you're catching your breath for anything, just save them. You know, if you get up and walk away and the computer locks, or, you know, you've got some sleep mechanism and then you come back on and the internet was disconnected while you were off because the hardware went to sleep, you might get an error saving that, and you'll have to redo some stuff because the connectivity was dropped. And it's just a really good practice for security and for seamless workflows to just have your staff save work. When you're done with something, save it. And when you go home at night, sign out of everything. sign out of Outlook, sign out of Neos, sign out of anything you're in. The reason for this being, between all of these things, you're going to get challenged to log into back to these systems the next day. Heaven forbid your machine gets compromised overnight while you're gone because it's running. At least be signed out of everything and make a layered defense mechanism as, okay, you got on my machine, that's terrible, but at least you're not already looking at my finances and my email and my case data, right? There's another challenge. There's another level of protection because I've signed out of everything. So even if you compromise the computer, it becomes increasingly harder to do anything with it. And, I think if you can implement these kind of best practices, your security posture, your security procedure, how you feel about protecting and how you can represent the protection of data, adhering to these things is always going to up-level that. It's always going to be a little bit better. It's strong. There's always more you can do. There's a very good parallel here, and I've heard Secret Service people say, they have to be right all day, every day, but the person trying to attack only has to be right once. And so it's super important to constantly be improving, constantly trying to make it better and not rest on your laurels, because all day, every day, you're in a position to need to defend this on multiple fronts. And you only have to lose once to leak something. And so be diligent, always be diligent, always be advancing, always be trying to tighten it up. And, the odds of this happening to you can be decreased, and you can mitigate these in the best way possible by just leveraging the tools that are available to you from both Microsoft and Assembly and local good practices and some of these third-party vendors like LastPass and Keeper and that kind of thing. And so with that, that is the end of the prepared remarks. So I'm going to stop sharing. And Marissa, do you want to come on and work through any of these questions? I'll grab a couple and answer them. I think I've answered some of these. So why can't I disable local Neos account authentication? Yes, you can. We should talk through that. Call into support and talk about how to do that. Will admins ever have the ability to block by region? If you're using SSO with Microsoft, look into those conditional access policies. Now, keep in mind, blocking by region is tricky because when you're doing something in a SaaS-based world, the best indicator of region you have is IP ranges and the route of how it got here. So can you block by region? Yes. Can creative people get around that? Yes. Is it absolutely perfect on saying you're coming from Europe? No, because it's based on IP ranges. Based on what I just said as well, it's better than nothing if you want to do that, but understand it's not perfect. It's, I always say things like it's not bulletproof, but it's definitely bullet resistant, right? So if you want to do that, look into the conditional access policies. Why doesn't Neos have best practices for SharePoint permission? This is a great question. And there's some more here. And basically what I want to talk about with this is that when you switch or when you rely on Microsoft's Active Directory for security, the security that you're granting users inside of SharePoint comes from the same place then that Neos will come from. And you have the ability, it's not incredibly, it's not off the shelf with Microsoft, but you do have the ability to go in and say, I want to create these kind of roles in Active Directory, these kinds of roles that will then be in SharePoint to say, you can't delete documents. Now, understand, if you can't delete documents and you've set up that SharePoint security to say user X can't delete documents, when they try to delete a document in Neos, they won't be able to. But that's what you asked. That's what you asked for. And it's important to understand that when you roll these things out, you can get that kind of security you're after, but it will blanket every interaction. So I would look at doing that, and the person who asked about that, I'm not going to call out names, but the person who asked about that, I would look at the granularity within Office 365 and Microsoft's Active Directory, the grants you can do for roles against SharePoint, And if you have an IT person, if you have anybody in your firm that has that level of ability, work with them on tightening that up to what you want. But you should not be, when we talk about principle of least access, you should not be blanket granting your entire staff the ability to wipe out your SharePoint repository. Odds are that's not required for their job, right? And so find levels in there. There's absolutely view only. There is absolutely edit and append only. There's absolutely no delete. You could even take them and say they can only interact with case folders, but not, provider documents and things like that. So you can really have a lot of control there. I would encourage you to get with your IT and work through the Microsoft side of that. A lot of questions are asking about the Microsoft SSO. So I think that's probably a good takeaway here. And I would encourage you to investigate that and roll that out in your firm if you believe that's a strong posture for you. And with that, Marissa, I'll give it back to you.
And thank you everybody for joining. Have a great day.